It begins right now. We begin with Russian President Vladimir Putin accusing Ukraine of a major provocation after Moscow said it was battling a major cross-border attack on the southwestern region. This has prompted the country to declare a state of emergency in the Kursk area. The acting regional governor, Alexei Smirnov, says the move was necessary to eliminate the consequences of enemy forces coming in. According to Moscow, up to 1,000 Ukrainian troops, as well as 11 tanks and more than 20 armored combat vehicles, entered Russia on Tuesday morning and launched an attack which killed at least 5 civilians and injured another 31, including 6 children. Russia said it used air and artillery firepower to repel the attack throughout Wednesday after earlier Russian reinforcements to the region. Its defense ministry published drone footage showing its forces striking what they call a US-made Bradley vehicle, as well as other military equipment belonging to the armed forces of Ukraine in the Kursk border region. Meanwhile, multiple residential buildings have been damaged in the Russian city of Belgorod in a shelling blamed on the Ukrainian armed forces. Belgorod Governor Vyacheslav Gladov says the unmanned aerial vehicle hit 2 residential buildings in the town of Shevakino, as well as 1 commercial building. Officials also reported 3 civilian injuries in the Shebensky municipal district. Emergency services are continuing operation at the scene of the attack to remove wreckage at the scene. Ukraine has also not commented on this shelling. The VOA's Ricardo Makina joins us now for more. Hi, Ricardo. Good to see you today.
Good to see you, too.
So what have you heard in terms of this cross-border incursion? Has Ukraine claimed responsibility?
Well, this is a major step for Ukrainian forces. For all this war, it's the first time from the Second World War that we see foreigner army going inside Russia, inside Kursk. So, of course, it's a very delicate moment for the Russian forces that see this enemy army going more than 10 kilometers inside. So there are different numbers in the table. The Russians say that they killed around 100 Ukrainian soldiers, that there are five civilians dead, 40 wounded. There are different numbers. I suppose that we will know more in the next days. But right now, this is the 3rd day that the Ukrainian forces that are inside Russia, and the numbers that are quite chaotic. If we believe the Russian numbers, we have 100 Ukrainian soldiers dead and 200 injured. And also, 40 Russian soldiers that are now under, in the Ukrainian side.
And speak to us more about, the casualties of this attack. The death toll, we understand that 5 people were killed and some 31 others injured. Are these numbers likely to rise?
Well, as I say, the numbers that are difficult to have a contract to know if they are really true, because the 2 sides are trying right now to minimize the impact of the death in their side. So we have not any numbers of how many Russians have died in these 3 days of fighting inside Russia. The Ukrainians tell us that they have 40 soldiers in their hand. Russia denies that, but we saw there are already few videos of drone videos of the Ukrainian armed forces that show us that a big number of Russian soldiers surrendered to the Ukrainian army in the first day of this operation.
And Russian President Vladimir Putin describes this as a major provocation by the Kyiv regime. Has there been any information provided on military casualties?
No, we have not the numbers of the Russian death, as I already told. But of course, the words of Putin, we must to take it very seriously, because as I told, is the first incursion in Russian soil from the Second World War. Putin gave yesterday a conference with his Minister of Defense, and we saw in his face that he was not happy at all. The situation is very, very complicated for Russia right now. Of course, they have a huge army, and we can assume that in the next hours they will try to reconquer this territory, and it will mean more casualties, more Russian casualties and Ukrainian casualties. But right now, Ukraine have changed the play on the ground.
Right, Ricardo, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Well, staying with the cross-border attacks, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev has suggested that Moscow should respond to Kyiv's attempted incursion in Kursk by taking over land that Moscow currently recognizes as Ukraine. Mr. Medvedev, who serves as deputy chair of the Russian Security Council, says going forward, the special military operations should become openly exterritorial in nature. He adds that there should be no restrictions in terms of recognized borders. Meanwhile, Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova suggests the attack is being used as a smokescreen for Kyiv to prolong what she called its deadly mobilization. In the meantime, the United States says it's not aware of the cross-border incursion by Ukraine into Russia. This is coming from U.S. Department of State spokesperson Matthew Miller, who says it's not unusual for Ukraine to provide Washington with information about its tactics before going forward with them. Mr. Miller also indicates that it's up to Ukraine to decide on the nature of its operations, as they are the other warring party in the ongoing war.
Ultimately, the decisions about how Ukraine conducts its military operations are decisions that Ukraine makes. Nothing has changed about our policy with respect to strikes across the border. Nothing with respect to the policy that we announced several months ago with respect to allowing the equipment that we provide to be used in strikes across the border to target sites, Russian military sites just across the board. Nothing about that policy has changed. So ultimately, these are all decisions that are left to Ukraine. We did not, but it's not unusual for the Ukrainians not to notify us of their exact tactics before they execute them. It's a war that they are conducting. We provide them with equipment, we provide them with advice, but when it comes to the kind of day-by-day tactics that they carry out, the day-by-day strikes that they take, sometimes we're in communication about them, sometimes we're not, and it's appropriate for them to make those decisions. I'll answer it this way. Nothing about our policy has changed, and with the actions that they are taking today, they're not in violation of our policy. So I don't have any conversations to speak to from the podium today, but obviously we have been watching first the protests and then later the riots in the UK over recent days. Everyone around the world has the right to exercise their rights to freedom of speech, their rights to freedom of assembly, but that does not in any way justify violence, does not justify rioting, and UK authorities are well within their rights to use all law enforcement authorities to hold those accountable who engage in violent activities.
Meanwhile, the European Commission says it cannot comment on the ongoing cross-border tensions in the Kursk region. Speaking during a press conference in Brussels, European Commission spokesperson Peter Stano says the bloc is in solidarity with Ukraine and recognizes Kyiv's right to hit enemy targets wherever it finds necessary.
When it comes to your question about the specific events that are ongoing in the area of Kursk region in Russia, this is not really for us to comment on. The European Union is not involved in and is not commenting the operational developments on the ground or on the front line, if you want. We are fully standing behind Ukraine's efforts to restore its territorial integrity and sovereignty and to push back and fight the illegal aggression by Russia. We don't speculate on what-if scenarios, but again, our very principled and general position is that Ukraine is under illegal aggression. So Ukraine is fighting a rightful defensive war. Based on international law, Ukraine has a right to defend itself, and this right to defend itself includes also hitting the enemy on his territory. We think that Ukraine is fighting a legitimate defensive war against an illegal aggression, and in the framework of this legitimate right to defend itself, Ukraine is entitled to hit the enemy wherever it finds necessary on its territory, but also on the territory of the enemy.
Let's speak to the publisher of Business Ukraine magazine, Peter Dickinson. Peter, great to have you today.
Hi, nice to join you.
Right, so first let's get your thoughts on the Russian former president's comments saying Moscow should no longer hold back in Ukraine, but to move forward with taking over lands it currently recognizes as Ukraine.
Well, it's hard from a Ukrainian perspective to see how they are holding back. Russia has destroyed dozens of towns and cities, literally reduced them to rubble. It bombs Ukrainian towns and cities on an almost daily basis. The entire Russian army, more or less, is already deployed in Ukraine. The only area where Russia could perhaps be holding back is the use of nuclear weapons. So it seems that Mr. Medvedev's comments are essentially rhetoric, essentially bombast, and suggest that the level of frustration in Moscow at the setbacks that they are now suffering in the Kursk region, the rather dramatic Ukrainian advances that we are seeing. Certainly, Medvedev is famed for his outrageous, often statements, his very bold and belligerent commentary. So there's no surprise there. But again, from a Ukrainian perspective, there really is no sense in Kiev that there's much room for escalation on the Russian side. They're already waging the largest European invasion since World War II. So if there was any intent to threaten Ukraine, it certainly sounds like an empty threat when heard from Kiev.
Right, and we've hardly heard, any commentary from, former leaders, of Ukraine or Russia since this war began. Well, not any that I've heard published anyway. What do you think he stands to gain from speaking up about this now and about this particular incursion?
Dmitry Medvedev has been a quite marginal figure in Russian politics for a number of years. He was, of course, the president, the holder president, who stood in for Putin while Putin stepped down constitutionally in 2008. He then himself stepped down to allow Putin to return in 2012 and served as prime minister for an extended period. But he was never really seen as anything more than a placeman, a representative for Putin, a proxy for Putin. Now he's since been relegated even further down the hierarchy of power. So by speaking out, as he actually fairly often does in relation to Ukraine, it is a way of him making himself relevant, showing that he's still a serious figure, and also endearing himself to Putin, to the Kremlin establishment, and perhaps also to the Russian public. So that certainly, it's not surprising to see him leading the rhetorical response to this recent this new Ukrainian offensive.
And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made no reference to the event in Kursk in his nightly video address, while the General Staff also did not mention it in the daily battlefield update. Many wonder what informed Russia's decision to pin this incursion on Ukraine.
Well, Ukraine has been very, very quiet about this incursion. They've said almost nothing, it's actually quite unusual. It reflects the high level of secrecy that has surrounded this entire operation. The Russians were clearly taken by surprise. The Ukraine's Western partners appear to have been taken completely by surprise also. And I can say that most Ukrainians were also taken completely by surprise. So it is actually a remarkable success story in that sense, that they've able to maintain this level of secrecy. And now they're continuing that by refusing to make official statements, by letting people speculate and guess as to the true objectives of Ukraine, what they're hoping to achieve, how far they're hoping to go, or how far they plan to go. I think that's certainly seen. So it's clear that the Ukrainians are doing that very deliberately. They clearly think it's in their interest to maintain that level of ambiguity about this operation, and they are looking to keep the Russians guessing. So far, they're succeeding.
Right, so secret that even the United States says, it's not aware of the cross-border incursion by Ukraine. It says the U.S. says, the U.S. says it's not unusual for Ukraine to provide Washington with information. What do you think was going on there?
Well, the Ukrainians obviously have a very close relationship with their American counterparts. They are to a high degree dependent on American military aid, so they cannot afford to antagonize America or to create any unpleasant surprises for the Americans, let's say. But also there is a sense that America is not always as discreet as it could be in terms of keeping information concealed. There have been a number of incidents also where America has reportedly prevented Ukraine from pursuing military operations, military plans that Kiev was looking to follow. So I think this is clearly, in this case, the Ukrainians independently developed these plans, assuming and perhaps counting on the fact that America, although they may not perhaps be thrilled about this new offensive, will look at it and say, okay, well, fair enough, this is a Ukrainian decision. The Ukrainians obviously know what they're doing, and ultimately it's their decision to make, which is essentially what the Americans are now saying. Although, of course, there is a hint in their comments that they're not particularly thrilled at the fact that this was a complete surprise for them as well.
Right, and Russian military estimates that up to 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers were involved in the attack, and that the US-made armored vehicles and equipment were used in this incursion. We know Ukraine has received its first F-16 fighter jets from Western allies. Are you surprised by the timing of this incursion?
Yes, frankly, I think I'm certainly surprised. I say the sense of surprise is pretty much universal, even here in Kiev. I'm not sure the F-16 delivery was a major factor. Ukraine received a handful, reportedly just 10 jets, and they plan to use them primarily in an air defense role, so essentially far from the front lines, because they fear that the jets will not be secure against Russian air defense, and they could be shot down. So I don't think that I wouldn't certainly attribute any great significance to the delivery of the F-16s. I think what we have here is an operation that was clearly planned some time in advance. Russia has mentioned up to 1,000 troops. There are reports that there are significantly more Ukrainian soldiers involved. There seems to be a substantial amount of armor as well, tanks and other armored vehicles that are involved in this offensive. There is also a large drone component, anti-aircraft capabilities, electronic warfare. So this is a serious operation that's been planned for some time. Ukraine's obviously been scheming and plotting this one, and again, somehow has managed to keep it under the radar so that the Russians themselves did not notice this build-up on their own border.
Russia is obviously the stronger party in this war, not really needing so many other countries to support it, maybe support it morally, but it has the equipment to fight this war. Do you think Moscow was shocked by this incursion? Shocked to such that they didn't think that Ukraine could come across so strongly?
Absolutely. No, it's certainly been a shock to the Russians. Russia, of course, is a much stronger military than Ukraine, a much larger military and a much larger economy. But Russia is also stretched quite thin. They've deployed almost all of their troops, we are led to believe, in Ukraine already. They are also receiving significant amounts of military aid from North Korea. They received large numbers of drones from Iran and also rockets from Iran, we believe, and also military technical assistance from China. So they are also to a high degree also dependent on their allies, but especially in terms of their commitment to Ukraine. They're they're stretched very thin. So while in Ukraine they enjoy dominance in terms of the overwhelming numbers they have, beyond Ukraine, there's not a lot there. And what we see in this attack here, essentially, is Ukraine has been able to push in, break through very weakly defended borders, and by all accounts now is moving forward at a rapid rate. The Ukrainian troops, according to the reports that we're seeing, unconfirmed I should say, but reports we're seeing today, have now advanced further in Russia than Russia has been able to advance in Ukraine all year.
Right, but the reports we're getting, that's probably the latest, that the cross-border operation has largely been thwarted by the Russian army and border guards. But if you recall, in May, Russian forces made advances north and northeast of Kharkiv, the second biggest city in Ukraine, intensifying attacks along the region. Do you see this latest incursion as a tit-for-tat action?
Well, there's all sorts of different motivations that could be at play here. Certainly, it's a morale boost for Ukraine and a demoralizing attack for Russia, which has created a significant amount of goodwill in Ukraine and optimism after a long period of defensive warfare, and vice versa. I think the opposite is true in Russia. It's shocked the Russians and the Russian public. It may be a bid to gain a foothold in Russia and to hold some territory, which could then be used as a bargaining chip in negotiations with Russia. Now, Russia at the moment occupies around 20% of Ukraine. There are regularly discussions about possible negotiations and what a future negotiated settlement could look like. Now, if Ukraine comes to the table with essentially empty hands and Russia holds a large part of Ukraine, it's very unlikely that Russia will agree to give up any of that land. So, of course, there is always the chance that Ukraine is now thinking, well, we're going to seize some Russian land and then we'll use that as a bargaining chip against Russia when the inevitable negotiations do take place.
Right, Peter, thanks again for your time today.
Thank you.